Okay, the topic of the day is aggregate supply and demand analysis. And you see the graphs, right? They're coming up. That's like a preview of what we're going to be looking at today. A lot of graphs. Our question of the day is, so what determines the state of the economy? Specifically, the level of prices, which is inflation, employment rate, and the output, so production level in the economy in the short run, right? Or you could rephrase this question. So why are there recessions? How do we explain them? How do we explain inflations? And in the next, 60 minutes, you're going to find out all the answers to the world's hardest questions. Of course, macroeconomists know all the answers. And here we go. Several definitions right off the bat. So what's aggregate demand? Demand, right? It's consumption, everything that people want to buy. So it's the amount of real output that the entire economy, remember, includes households, firms, government, and foreigners. So the entire economy wants to buy at each possible price level. So, and this is a reminder here that GDP, or the real output, consists of the demand by consumers in C, then firms I, the government G, and foreigners, so exports. Now we subtract everything produced not in the US as imports, and that becomes the GDP. Well, now let's think about why aggregate demand curve. If we were to draw the production that people want to buy, or the output that people want to buy, against the price, against the price level. So when prices are higher, let's say the price index is 115 as opposed to 100, I claim, or economists claim, that people will buy more at lower prices. Or in other words, that aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So people will buy less at higher prices and more at lower prices. And it kind of seems obvious that if the amount of money in the economy is fixed for the time being, then we have more money available, or we're richer when the prices are lower, and we can just afford. Seems simple as that. We can afford more stuff, right? So that's wealth effect. We can just buy more goods when prices are lower. So this component C, consumption, is higher at lower prices or lower at higher prices. Then there's another effect, foreign trade effect, is that when our prices are higher or when they're going up, then what do foreigners do? Do they buy more of our stuff or less? Just think about it for a second. Well, our prices are going higher. They, of course, want less of our exports because everything else held the same. So that's what we are assuming here. Nothing else changes. Their prices don't change. It's a model, right? We have to make assumptions. So if everything else held the same, but our prices are going up, then they will be buying less of our stuff and we will be importing more because their prices didn't change as ours did. So that's the second reason. And the third reason would be, with higher prices, we also have higher interest rates. And so the investment income is always lower at higher interest rates. And that's the reason for why this happens. Okay, so aggregate, we've established convincing reasons for why aggregate demand is downward sloping and not a flat line and not a straight vertical line, but just a regular shaped demand curve. So, but on the aggregate scale, so we're talking about aggregate scale. The entire economy wants to buy stuff. Okay, now, just like a regular demand curve, aggregate demand curve can shift right and left in the same way. An increase would be a rightward shift. So why would all of a sudden, for reasons other than prices, right? Remember, shift means reasons other than the vertical variable. So some other reasons that makes either consumption or investment or government spending or net exports to increase, let's say. Well, let's look at consumption first. What can make people buy more stuff? Maybe our wealth has increased, so we've become richer, or we think we became richer because of the stock market gains, or housing prices are going up, right? Or maybe our incomes are universally increasing. So we're on a good spin of in our business cycle, and incomes are increasing overall. So our consumer optimism is increasing. So we go out and shop and buy more cars, right? More durable goods, more furniture, maybe even more housing. But housing is included into investment. So maybe our household debt hasn't decreased, and therefore we feel like practically richer, and we want to buy more stuff. Maybe our taxes have decreased, income taxes, and now we have more disposable income. Or maybe economic conditions have changed in a way that made it easier for us to obtain credit, and therefore we are more likely to get more durable goods on credit. Or perhaps lower interest rates have encouraged us to spend more money. So all these are reasons for why consumer spending can increase and therefore shift the aggregate demand to the right. Okay, so there's also business-related demand. Business investment can increase and shift the aggregate demand to the right in response to lower interest rates or higher expected returns in the future. See, all of a sudden, imagine that businesses realize that, in the next 3 months, travel will return to normal, that everybody's going to be vaccinated and there are no other bad variants of the COVID virus, right? So business activity will resume, all the gatherings and concerts will resume, then that will spur business expectations to run wild, and there will be more in business investment into things like airlines and travel and hotels and all that. So there could also be other reasons for why businesses might try to invest more or suddenly decide to invest more. There could be fewer regulations and better business conditions from the point of view of businesses. Sometimes regulations are constraining, like if you have new environmental laws that don't allow you to pollute the environment as much, you might think that this is a negative, although this could probably, it's more likely to affect business supply. So we are thinking about demand right now. What is it that makes businesses buy more stuff and invest more stuff into their production? Well, lower business taxes, new technology, less excess capacity is when you have fewer inventories, like cars that are already produced sitting in your lot. Now you want to produce more because you see that your capacity is going away. Okay. Excess capacity, of course. So government spending is one of the major factors that explains shifts in the aggregate demand. For example, more government spending on education, on healthcare, increases aggregate demand, but also more government spending on bad things like war, like cleaning up an oil spill also contributes to increased aggregate demand. So, and finally, the final component of the GDP is net exports. So whatever makes exports go up will also increase aggregate demand. So what are the things that can make exports go up other than price level? The dollar. So the value of the dollar is one of the primary factors. So if the dollar becomes weaker, our goods and services become more attractive, not less. Foreigners want to buy more of our stuff. So weaker dollar is actually very good for exports. And a less obvious reason would be, what if foreigners' income increases relative to ours? So Europeans, let's say what Europeans become richer, they want more of our stuff. So basically, if our incomes fall relative to foreign incomes, then we also tend to export more, right? So moving on, I mentioned that investment demand is a response to interest rates. But there's one more thing that I need to add, is that when we talk about a shift in aggregate demand, right or left, investment is the most volatile component of aggregate demand, and it causes more kind of erratic shifts. So just because businesses are very sensitive to things like interest rates and business conditions. So, and how are they sensitive? Well, look at this picture. We say that at higher interest rates, so interest rate is a price of money, price of borrowed funds, or on the market of things like loanable funds, right? The interest rate is the price. So put it on the vertical axis. And at a higher price of funds, there'll be less funds demanded or less investment. And at lower interest rates, there will be more funds demanded. Okay. What affects business investment is technology, expectations, taxes, operating costs, and of course, interest rates. All right, so now we are going to look at a couple of graphs. So on these graphs, there so these are basically historical pictures of consumption spending and residential investment. So kind of the residential investment is on housing, and it's included into I and not C. So C, consumption, is the entire C, and a little part of I. That's what we're looking at. So what happened during the most recent recession related to the financial crisis, so 2008? Consumption fell, so people's spending fell. They fell during the recession. They did not actually fall before the recession, but the residential investment already started falling before the recession. So kind of like, if you think to yourself, oh, this might be an indicator that kind of allows us to predict a year ahead what's about to happen. Yes, you're on the right track. Probably, maybe, if you can say, oh, people are spending less on housing, maybe we're about to enter bad times. Well, yes, maybe. Although this is still a bit of a voodoo science, right? So there's no exact correlation. So other components, what happened to other components of GDP or aggregate demand during the financial crisis? Net exports, so our exports increased, actually. So net exports are usually negative, they became less negative. So exports increased. Why? Because of the dollar value. So dollar value dropped a bit, and foreigner and U.S. products became more attractive to foreigners. So, but after the recession, we entered good times, and our exports started to decrease a bit, and but imports never really returned to those level, I guess, that they used to be before. Right, so it looks like, according to this graph. So there's also a little note here on the slide that references loose monetary policy that kept the value of the US dollar down. We will talk about loose versus tight monetary policy in our last class in a couple of weeks. And that refers to low interest rates. So all it is loose monetary policy means low interest rates policy. It keeps the value of the dollar down because, who wants to invest into currency that doesn't, or into bank accounts that don't pay much in terms of interest? So the interest rate's too low, makes a little less attractive as an investment currency. So now, that was aggregate demand story, right? Now we're going to have a story of aggregate supply, see what it's all about. But there are two types of aggregate supplies, or at least two curves that we will draw. And one is going to describe our long-run capacity to produce. So not our capacity to produce within the short period of time, but our long-run potential capacity to produce, called long-run aggregate supply curve. Notice on this graph, it is always going right, always moving right, because as we grow up as a society, right, as our technology expands, we're capable of producing more and more because we have larger population, because we have the internet now when our grandparents didn't. And we're just that good, and we're able to produce more and more. Well, we have better machines too. So long-run aggregate supply should be increasing, should better be increasing, or else it's a sign of a problem. Like, why would it be decreasing? That means our economic pie is shrinking potentially. So in the long run, our output, potential output, is determined by how many workers we have, what technology we have, how many factories, and how much machinery we have. It is not related whatsoever to the price level. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the price is. Our capabilities are determined by our abilities to produce. Yet, in the short run, price does matter. We're about to show it. But before that, let's keep in mind one definition. The definition is the potential or full employment GDP. So, okay, if population drops significantly, can the long-run aggregate supply drop? Yeah, of course. If there is a, let's say, giant global warming problem too, all right? Can you imagine global warming destroying sort of droughts and fires and some extreme weather swings? It destroys our ability to produce, half of our arable land, right? That could also reduce our ability to produce. But I don't think it ever happened in the past that year to year our economy was able to produce less and less. It's always been more and more. Well, we'll see what happens in our lifetime, right? With all the catastrophes. No, let's be optimistic and say, no, this should be going up all the time. And it should determine long-run aggregate supply curve, should determine our full employment GDP. So full employment, comfortable GDP. Remember, full employment does not mean 100% employment. It means a little bit of maybe 45% unemployment, which is nice and comfortable for everybody to switch careers. All right, so short run aggregate supply curve is a different relationship. So in the short run, things are slightly different. In the short run, what do we see is that when prices of outputs, right? Remember GDP deflator or consumer price index could also be used here. It measures the prices of final goods and services, right, that are sold to consumers. The GDP, final goods and services, and CPI, they're sold to consumers. And what do we say here? We say that the ability to produce in the short run, or our willingness to produce, or businesses' willingness to produce, increases as prices go up. So why is it the case? Why is it the case? Well, because there are inputs and outputs into production, and one of the inputs is wages and some prices of raw materials. So something for which we had already locked into contracts, especially wages. So labor is the largest component of our cost of production, right? And wages tend to be sticky. So that's an important point. Wages tend to be sticky. The contracts don't get negotiated every day. In fact, they only get negotiated once a year. And then if prices go up during the year, the wages don't go up just as fast. And sometimes it takes years to renegotiate different kind of wages. So wages are only adjusted infrequently. Therefore, so for the time being, as prices of output go up, it may be that your input prices are not rising that fast. Okay, so, and there are also menu costs in terms of updating your output prices. So prices are sticky for some time being too. That's what it means. The menu cost is that, if you're a restaurant, it is kind of costly to reprint all the menus that you're handing out at the tables. So you don't do it every day. You don't even do it every month. So even though the prices might be rising out there, you only do it infrequently. So that all explains, some way why there might be a response from companies to higher prices. Okay, so is there evidence that wages are sticky? There is some evidence. There's a percentage of workers with no wage changes. Percentage of workers with no wage changes. And the percentage increased after financial crisis to 17%. So there are a lot of workers whose wages throughout the year don't change. And especially firms are unlikely to cut wages. So wages are sticky downward, and there's pretty good evidence for that. And it's sometimes easier for firms to lay off workers than to say, we've got to take a wage cut of 10%. So in bad times, it's often optimal to have a wage cut for everybody because prices tend to go down and so do wages. But how do you explain that to workers, right? So what happens is some workers are let go and new workers are rehired at low wages. Okay, so we have an aggregate supply curve or short run aggregate supply curve that can shift left and right. So left shift is a decrease. Why can all of a sudden companies may decide to supply less, so in the short run, or to supply more. All that is response to business conditions of some kind, okay? Just keep in mind, it's all a response to business conditions. So the cost of production rises, right? Some cost of lumber. I heard just yesterday on NPR, nowadays, lumber, there's a shortage of lumber and the prices of lumber are going up because there is a construction boom apparently going on with people moving away from cities into suburbs. And we may see temporary reduction in supply because there's a shortage of trees, I guess, or a temporary shortage of lumber. Or maybe because lumber is now more expensive and the cost of production is so much higher. Now, wages is another important component. If we see higher wages, or suddenly higher wages, or slowly higher wages, we may also argue that aggregate supply can shift left at least a bit. We can have a resource shock of some kind, such as oil prices, that can bring about higher prices suddenly, and that would be shown as a leftward shift in the supply. Prices of imported inputs rise. That could also be a reason. The reasons can be productivity, suddenly lower productivity. However, that's hard to imagine. Productivity keeps rising, in fact, right? So we have better technology, better quality of resources and labor and capital. So productivity usually explains a rightward shift in the supply curve. Now, but we can also have legal or institutional or other business environment changes, such as higher taxes, lower subsidies, more regulations, and they can also make, it creates incentives for businesses to reduce production. And finally, there's expectations. So if we expect future prices going up, say we're all suspecting that inflation rate is going to be, say, 5%, so we incorporate 5% increase in our wages for our workers, and that is, and now I'm talking about real increase in wages, and we have a shift to the left in our aggregate supply, at least a small one. Okay. How expectations of future price level affect the short run aggregate supply curve? Okay, well, that's the case where firm and workers anticipate 3% inflation in 2019 compared to 2018, and as a result, the leftward shift due to rising cost of production, and we have just that happening. So if it's like a universal increase in like all labor contracts by 3% here, we do end up with inflation, but with 3.5% or so, kind of like self-fulfilling expectations. As everyone incorporated inflation to their contract, yes, we end up with higher cost of output. So what's long-run macroeconomic equilibrium? The economy is in equilibrium when it is producing its potential amount of output. In this picture, it's $20 trillion. So measured in 12 dollars, so it's in real kind of comparable dollars over time. And then the price level is at a certain level. So at a certain level, we have and it's like a triple intersection of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and the long run potential supply curve. Okay, so the equilibrium, but The economy is not always in equilibrium, and let's see what can happen. So all the cases that can happen to an economy that kind of kicks it out of the stable state. First, well, suppose there's a decrease in aggregate demand, which can happen, which happens all the time, in fact, and it happened during COVID too, right? So decrease in aggregate demand suddenly for travel, for everything. So, and in this case, it may be due to interest rates. So interest rates increase. They actually have been very low lately, so it's not our case, but suppose it's in case of interest rates of COVID. Or just a reduction in consumer optimism, let's say. We have a decline in C, the component of aggregate demand C, consumption. And what do we have? We have a lower. So we're moving from point A on this graph to point B. And what is the difference between these 2 points is that at point B, the output is lower and the prices are lower. And what is a recession? Recession means lower output. So lower prices are okay. So it's easy to really combat deflation. You just print more money. So it's not a problem, but the decline in output on the x-axis means there are fewer jobs out there. So there's an increase in unemployment. So that's how we see recession. Every decline in output that puts us below our potential long-run average supply curve is a recession. Okay, and that's pictured in this graph. Okay, now what happens next as a response? Well, we were in point B in recession, and as firms and workers adjust to the new price level, and the new price level is lower, so where the wages are lower, and then companies realize, oh, so the input prices decreased, the wages decreased, why not hire more people? So that's the story here. Prices decreased and wages did, and so companies started to hire more people. So as a result, aggregate supply shifted to the right, and the economy stabilized itself. So it corrected its own problem. So we ended up in point C at our potential long-run output, so the comfortable level of production. So what this story tells you is that left to its own devices, the economy can cure its own problems. The only issues that may take a while. So a prolonged enough recession is problematic for many reasons. There may be an increase in crime, there may be duration of unemployment that is so long that people lose their skills, and there may be increase in suicides and mental health issues. So doesn't always seem like a good idea to wait for a long time till the economy recovers itself, which it does eventually, but it makes sense to kickstart some fiscal and monetary policy measures to help the economy out of the recession. Okay, which we'll talk about in the next class, what the measures might be. Yet this story tells you that the economy can do it on its own if everyone survives and keeps their mental health through the recession. Okay. The story also in the last graph, the story was also is that all wages and prices decreased and people were okay with it, right? So just think about it. People are not always okay with lower wages, right? We're okay with low prices, but lower wages kind of makes us a bit disturbed, right? Whereas a macroeconomist would tell you, so what? That's because we were in recessions. There was no upward pressure on prices. Wages should be going down, right? Well, now as economists, you understand that. All right, so what if we have an increase in aggregate demand? Okay, here we have a case where we are starting out in point A. We're starting out in point A, and we and suppose this loan and aggregate supply curve does not exist yet. So we only have, so I guess I should change this graph a bit. It has too many curves right now, but imagine there's only one shift here. We're starting with an equilibrium in point A, and the only shift that happens is an increase in aggregate demand. Just because we have become as consumers more optimistic, we're thinking COVID's over, we're starting to consume more. Actually, COVID may have been an example of a reduction, temporary reduction in our loan and aggregate supply curve. Just a thought, right? Temporary went down, potential output, and that went back up, or will be going back up. So yeah, I was just going back to this example. Sudden increase in consumer optimism, what happens? We end up at the intersection of, we end up in point B. So at point B, we have what? Higher output and higher prices. Higher output is a good thing, not a bad thing, you might say, even though it's above our potential, right? So it's a good thing, but if we're producing and operating above our potential, well, maybe some things happen, like whoever was a student otherwise decided to quit their school because the job market is so good that they could be hired, and maybe decided to postpone his education. And maybe in the long run, it's not the best decision. And maybe some other people, retired people who would otherwise be enjoying their retirement, went out to work because the wages are so good. And yeah, I don't see it as a problem, especially, some people bring up, okay, well, at this point, maybe teenagers are working at a high rate, but I actually think it's a good thing if teenagers are working in the summer or after school. So I don't see that increase above potential output as a problem. The only problem here is that it puts pressure on prices. So the prices are going up. As you see from the level that's 115, we're moving to level 118. So inflation becomes a problem. So putting pressure on prices. And in response to that specific increase in prices, wages also tend to go up, right? That's the story, Jerry. And so long run aggregate supply shifts to the left. And as a result, we are back to our normal, comfortable state of long run aggregate supply with full employment. But we end up with higher prices. Okay, so that's the drawback. But we're back to our comfortable level of production. So restored the equilibrium. And that's another way to say the economy is capable of restoring its own equilibrium. All right. So what if we don't have a demand shock, but we have a sudden supply shock, such as an increase in oil prices? So the increase in input prices, because oil is a major input in production, results in a recession too, as you see in this graph. So short run aggregate supply shifts left, so we move from point A to point B, and we end up with less output, but at the same time, higher prices, right? So the both of two evils occur at the same time. We have unemployment and inflation. So that is stagflation, stagnation, economic stagnation, and inflation, two in one, like shampoo and conditioner, right? So bad case. Did it ever happen? Yeah, something like this happened in the 80s during the oil shocks, maybe even in the 70s too, because oil prices go high and then so all the other prices kind of catching up, or we end up in that scenario. What happens then as a response? How does the economy, in a way, recovers itself? Well, we have a move back to point A. Why does aggregate supply suddenly start to increase? Because when there's some unemployment going on in the economy, and there's always unemployment when we are below potential GDP, then there's the salaries don't increase; they actually start to fall a bit. So the labor market becomes more competitive, and workers tend to agree to work for lower wages. Okay, so cost of production, a little bit over time, it decreases in a way, and that shifts aggregate supply curve to the right. So back at our normal equilibrium. So that's the story, right? So aggregate, like every story brings us through adjustment through wages. So through firms realizing that wages become too high and therefore aggregate supply is shifting left, or the wages have become not too low, but low enough to start hiring more. And so aggregate supply shifts to the right. So the question here is, how long does it take to restore full employment? It from a resource shock, like an oil shock, and the answer is can take a few years. Therefore, that's another call, perhaps, for monetary and fiscal policy action from the government. So monetary and fiscal policy action. So example of fiscal policy was unemployment compensations and stimulus checks during COVID. And the monetary policy would be lower interest rates. Okay, so another interesting observation from at least one of the economists here, but I bet there are more than one, is that so does it really matter what causes the decline in aggregate demand in terms of the duration of the subsequent recession? And it turns out that housing the index of a real residential construction that has dropped like a bubble. Like housing is a result of the housing bubble bursting. So the prices of housing have declined significantly, and so there is some. So there's some economists who believe that the recessions respond very much to booms and busts. Yeah. Okay, so another interesting graph here is that, so business cycles, to what extent are they each other? So how long does it take for the recession, from the start of the recession to a complete recovery? And or how much time does it pass from one business cycle to another? Is it on average 10 to 12 years, or is it something else? Well, it turns out that the business cycles actually vary a lot. Have been lately varying a lot in duration. Some take 14 quarters, like 3.5 years since peak. Some take very short period of time. Some recessions are small, some large. So I guess it does matter what caused the recession. Is it like a giant housing bubble? Is it a financial crisis? And yeah, there are economists who believe that financial crises tend to cause quite more severe recessions than something else. I wonder what's going to be next, right? COVID. Nobody could have predicted COVID and that recession. But, economists say that macroeconomists have predicted 15 out of the last 8 recessions, right? So we are very precise as a science in terms of our ability to predict things. Okay, so back to the aggregate supply and demand model. There's nothing new here. All we're going to say with this, there are multiple lines, but all it says is that the economy is growing, long run aggregate supply is shifting from one year to the next, from 20, say, $1 trillion to 20.4, let's say in 20, in 1 year to the next. Yeah, let's keep it that way. And then we're starting out in point A with a certain aggregate demand and supply. We have aggregate supply growing over time, short run aggregate supply growing from the curve 1 to curve 2. But what if aggregate demand is not catching up? What if the aggregate demand is growing slower? Is it in this graph growing slower? Actually, it's growing just as fast. So in this graph, everything is moving to the right and kind of moving synchronously, right? So both aggregate supply and demand is moving to the right, slowly and carefully, and nothing in terms of prices changes. Right? So you see that the potential output is increasing, but the price level is stable. There's no recession because we are always operating at our potential, right? So the problems only start when our, let's say, demand outpaces supply or supply outpaces demand. Look at this graph. So in this graph, we have the demand that is growing a lot, aggregate demand, right? So maybe people became more optimistic, or have started spending a lot, or the interest rates became too low, people started spending a lot. And but the aggregate supply has only increased kind of modestly, right? So what we see is that while the economy is at its potential, we see a higher price, right? Higher price level. So that could be one of the causes of inflation. So one of the explanations of inflation, it's demand pooled. So pooled by this demand, or pushed, we would say. Demand, but I think it's called demand pool, but the word doesn't matter, it's just caused by an increase in people's willingness to buy as opposed to the economy's willingness to produce. So, and we have inflation, one of the reasons. And the other reason we saw that supply went down, right, as an oil shock case. In what happened during the recession. So here we're using the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to try to explain what happened to the economy during the financial crisis. So over time, potential GDP should be increasing. So we're drawing it as these 2 yellow lines, vertical lines. That's our long run aggregate supply. It should be going up. But the economy is already operating below potential. So where are we at first? In 2007, the equilibrium is with the demand 2007 and supply 2007. So we're already in recession in a way. No, actually, we're not in recession because or are we? We're still at the intersection of our at least short on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So yeah, while producing below potential, we're still doing okay. And then the housing bubble blew and the financial crisis occurred, which reduced people's income and therefore their willingness to buy stuff. So aggregate demand went down, and what happened to aggregate supply? It also went down because prices were still going up. Oh, because of the oil prices. Okay, so remember at that time, they were also increasing oil prices. So just like in case of oil supply shock, we have a reduction in aggregate supply at the same time as aggregate demand. So we were attacked on two fronts. So aggregate demand and supply decreased. And so we ended up in the equilibrium of 2008. Although, shouldn't it be, I don't think it's marked correctly on this graph, right? It should be in the intersection of the new aggregate demand curve. It doesn't change the story, right? Because we do have an increase in prices and a further reduction in output. So higher and higher unemployment and higher gap between the potential employment and the actual employment. So potential GDP and actual GDP. And this slide is just a reminder of what happened with during the crisis. The housing bubble, the financial crisis, and the rapid increase in oil prices. So, so that we know that we're drawing correct shifts in aggregate supply and demand. Okay, now I'm going to tell you briefly about several macroeconomic schools of thought, because macroeconomics is not as developed, is not as precise as micro. It has been following, or at different times, different schools of thoughts, and there are currently economists who kind of side with one school or with the other, and whether all of them or none of them are correct, it's a question, but to some extent all of them have their points, important points that we should learn from, and none of them completely really explains all the shifts and all the ups and downs in the economy. So our aggregate supply and demand model is inspired by new Keynesian economics. So Keynes was an economist during the Great Depression who advised the government what to do and explained why the government's policies are important, fiscal policies and monetary policies. In fact, his ideas were revolutionary at the time. So the role of the government was not well thought out before John Maynard Keynes. So wage stickiness is something that we use today. It is kind of implicit in Keynes's theory, but he didn't really use the same words to explain it. So it's a new Keynesian idea. So other ideas were inspired by other economists, such as there's a monetarism, so the monetarist model introduced by Milton Friedman, and he argued that the economy should be increasing the money supply at a constant rate, like 2% or so, and and that the Fed should not really worry about inflation. His theories is related to quantity theory of money. You may find a mentioning of that in your textbook. I will not ask you about it probably because we have not been focusing about it, just an overview. So the new classical macroeconomics is also emerged relatively recently in the 70s, based on the ideas of Robert Lucas, the economist who introduced rational expectations that the entire economy, like workers and firms, have rational expectations about price levels, and if the expectations are wrong, then the wages of the prices could be too high or too low, and then that causes business cycles. So employees either uh, hire too much or too many workers and produce too much, or too few workers produce too little. As a result, we see recessions and expansion. There is also real business cycle theory, where all the monetary activities are kind of rejected as a cause of recession or upswings in the economy, and everything is explained in terms of productivity cycles. So, uh, okay, so this is a very short. The maintain aggregate supply is vertical even in the short run. So there's no, because the idea that aggregate supply in the short run is upward sloping is kind of a little bit based on the fact that people are not exactly capable of predicting future price levels, so they slightly make mistakes in terms of wage contracts and things like that. Finally, the two last schools, the Austrian School of Economics, based on the most recent works of Ludwig Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. So they wrote back in the 40s. And they mainly argued with the socialist and communist economists, saying that it's impossible to sustain steadily planned economy. It's just not going to function. They were right, actually. It was impossible to sustain steadily planned economy. You can't plan out millions of goods and services and produce the right amount without computers, without anything. You can't plan out the right amount. And even if you do, it would probably not going to come up with better solutions than a incentive-based market system. So Austrians argue, Austrian economics, they're not necessarily live in Austria, but they're Austrian followers of Austrian School of Economics, argue that there is most recent financial crisis. So the Fed cut interest rates so low in fighting the recession previously, and therefore may have induced the cycle because low interest rates led to too much investment into housing and overinvestment as a result of it. And finally, the last school of economics, you could say, or maybe of political economy, more likely than economics, is the Marxian school. Karl Marx believed in many, many different things, that including that labor theory of value, that the value of goods and services is entirely determined by how much labor is embodied in it. So how many hours of work were spent to make a chair that compared to a table, so would be the difference in the price of the table and chair. And of course, he believed in the contradiction that arise naturally within the capitalist system, where the proletariat and the bourgeoisie have to conflict, and as a result, the proletariat rebel else and produces a revolution. And as a product of that revolution, the society moves to a more advanced stage of development, of communism, a society with no money and no inequality. All these ideas are awesome and they have been tested multiple times, and unfortunately, they did not work as well. Maybe countries just screwed up the implementations, but the ideas are great. Okay, so that's the story today. Hardcore macroeconomics. Hope you enjoyed it.